The wolf beneath the ice. In the northernmost valley of Everfrost, winter never truly ended. Not the way winter ends in other places, where snow retreats to shadow and mud takes its place, where birds return with their foolish optimism, where children run barefoot across warming earth. Winter did not make concessions here. It did not negotiate. It did not soften at the edges or grow merciful with the passage of years. In Everfrost, winter ruled. The sky above the valley sat perpetually the color of old iron, not quite storm, not quite peace, a gray that had outlasted every season that tried to change it. The pines along the ridge stood not as living things but as dark stitches against that pale canvas. Ere their branches bowed beneath weight they had carried for so long, they no longer remembered what it felt like to be unburdened. Snow did not fall there. It presided. Wind did not howl there. It judged. Every traveler who had ever stumbled into Everfrost by accident described the same sensation upon crossing the valley's invisible threshold. The sudden, undeniable feeling of being watched, not by anything hostile, not by anything cruel, simply by something very, very old that had been watching for a very, very long time and had long since decided that patience was a form of power. They were not wrong. At the heart of that frozen wasteland, beyond the last cluster of low stone cottages, beyond the tree line where the pines grew dense and strange and the snow between them was never disturbed by footprint or paw, stood the wolf. Massive, regal, terrifying in the way that cathedrals are terrifying, not because they threaten, but because they remind you of how small your life is compared to what endures. Its body towered higher than the oldest pine trees, a monument of frozen fury stopped mid-motion, mid-breath, mid-howl, as though time itself had reached out one gray hand and simply said, "Not yet." Its fur appeared sculpted from crystal frost, each individual strand caught in eternal stillness, glinting like 10,000 tiny mirrors when the rare winter light found it at the right angle. The effect was hypnotic. The effect was wrong, in the way that beautiful things are sometimes wrong, too precise, too permanent, too much like something that was meant as a warning. Its eyes were sealed shut, buried beneath layers of ancient blue ice that had built up over centuries. If you looked closely, and most people did not, because standing close enough to look was something most people avoided, you could see shapes in that ice. Not random. Not the chaotic crystal structures of naturally frozen water. Something deliberate. Something that pressed from the inside as if trying, very slowly and with great patience, to get out. The villagers called it a relic, an artifact of a time before careful living, before the wisdom of keeping your head down and your fire banked and your prayers vague and inoffensive. They called it a curse, something that had happened to someone who deserved it, someone who had reached too far, wanted too much, disturbed the balance that winter worked so hard to maintain. They called it a warning, the clearest possible message that the ancient powers of Everfrost were not to be petitioned, not to be approached, and absolutely not to be spoken to. They were right about some of it. They were wrong about the most important part. Because buried beneath those centuries of ice, beneath the frozen fur and the sealed eyes and the terrible stillness, there was something the villagers had never considered, had never wanted to consider, because it would have changed everything about how they chose to live. Consciousness lingered. Dim at first, stretched thin across centuries the way a voice becomes when you shout it into a vast and echoing canyon, but present, waiting. Aware of waiting, aware of the waiting having no foreseeable end. It had been waiting for 300 years. It had been waiting for a voice. It had been waiting for her. Before we begin, if you love dark Lycan Kings, forbidden mates, yea, and stories that make your heart ache, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe for epic Lycan King romances, where omegas rise, kings fall, and love is never gentle. The girl no one noticed her name was Alara. And it is important to understand, before anything else, what kind of person she was, because the world had worked very hard to convince her she was not particularly any kind of person at all. She was the kind of girl the eye slides past, not because she was unpleasant to look at, or dressed poorly, or carried herself with any kind of shame, but because there was something about her stillness that made her seem, to careless observers, simply like part of the furniture of a room, part of the scenery, a background detail, too quiet, too thin, too strange. She had her mother's gray eyes, which were the color of the valley sky in the hour before a storm, not threatening, but serious. She had long, dark hair that she braided back practically, because practicality was the luxury she could afford when others could not. Her hands were her most telling feature, calloused and red-knuckled and strong in ways that spoke of years of labor rather than years of care. The villagers tolerated her because she was useful. She hauled water from the frozen wells in the early hours before anyone else was awake, because she had discovered that working in the dark meant fewer people to ignore her. She mended torn furs and patched worn boots for a fraction of what the cobbler charged. She chopped wood until her fingers bled through the wool wrappings she wound around them each morning. Until the small woodpile behind her leaning cottage grew into the only thing in her life that was indisputably, comfortingly large. She asked for very little. She received slightly less. Her cottage sat at the very edge of the village, where the lane petered out and the frost-hardened earth gave way to snow that no one had bothered to clear, because no one had bothered to come this far. It leaned slightly against the prevailing wind, like a person who has given up arguing with the direction things were blowing and simply decided to lean into it instead. In high winds, it creaked and shuddered. In blizzards, it groaned. But it held. Alara had a theory about things that held. She believed that endurance was not the absence of breaking. She believed it was what happened when something was held together by something more stubborn than the forces trying to take it apart. Her cottage was held together by cold, hardened mud and iron stubbornness. Her life was held together by the same materials, more or less. She lived alone. She had always lived alone in the way that mattered. The way that isn't about physical proximity, but about the deeper aloneness of not being truly witnessed by anyone, of doing and thinking and feeling in a kind of interior privacy so complete it began to feel less like solitude and more like invisibility. But every night, no matter how exhausted she was from the hauling and the mending and the chopping, no matter how the cold bit at her face on the walk, no matter how the snow came down or the wind cut across the open ground between the tree line and her door, Alara took her lantern, and she walked beyond the tree line, and she spoke to the frozen wolf, the ritual of words. The first time she stood before the wolf, she had been 12 years old, and the world had just done the unkindest thing it had yet managed to do to her. Her mother had died 3 days earlier. A swift illness, the kind that arrived without courtesy and left without ceremony, taking with it the only person who had ever looked at Alara and seemed to genuinely see her. Her mother had been a woman of small joys and large silences, and she had passed both on to her daughter, along with the gray eyes and the practical braids and the cottage that leaned. The burial had been a quiet thing. The village had not come. They said the storm was too dangerous for travel, even the short distance to the frost-hard ground at the edge of the churchyard. They said it with the particular apologetic firmness of people who have made a decision they know is unkind and have chosen to blame the weather for it. Alara had buried her mother alone, in the snow, with a shovel that was too heavy for her arms and a grief that was too heavy for her chest. Then she had walked, without direction, without purpose, without any particular destination beyond away from the cottage with its new and terrible quiet, away from the village with its lights in the windows and its families behind them, away from everything that knew she existed and still somehow, hadn't come. She had been walking for perhaps an hour when the trees thinned and the clearing opened and the wolf appeared. She had known it was there, of course. Everyone in the village knew it was there. But knowing about something and encountering it alone in the dark at the worst moment of your young life are two entirely different experiences. She should have run. She didn't. Even then, even at 12, even raw with grief and cold and the particular exhaustion of being someone who works very hard for very little, something in her recognized something in the wolf. Not familiarity, exactly. Something older than familiarity. Something like resonance. She had placed her small, trembling hand against the ice of its frozen paw, the paw that was bigger than her entire body. And she had pressed her palm flat against the cold, and she had said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I think you're lonely too." The wind stilled. Not dramatically, not with any great performance of supernatural response, just a subtle cessation, a pause in the howling, an exhale from the valley that had been holding its breath. It was enough. Alara went home that night and slept, for the first time in 3 days, without nightmares. And the next night, she returned to the clearing, and the next, and the next. Years passed. She was 13 and she told him about the baker who gave her 12 coins when the work had been worth 14, and the complicated arithmetic of whether to say something and risk losing even the 12, or say nothing and preserve the income and the dignity of the baker, who was a small man in more ways than his height. She was 15, and she told him about the first real blizzard she'd survived alone, and how she'd packed every gap in the cottage walls with strips of cloth soaked in tallow, and how the cold had come in anyway through the floor, and how she'd spent 3 days wrapped in every fur she owned, reading the same 4 pages of a book her mother had left until she had memorized them. She was 17, and she told him about the merchant's son who had looked at her across the market square with something that might have been interest, and how she had looked away, because interest felt like a foreign currency in a country she didn't know the exchange rate for. She was 19, and she told him she was tired. That the tiredness wasn't physical exactly, or not only physical. That it was the kind of tired that comes from carrying the weight of being invisible for a very long time, and that some mornings she woke up and the first thought she had was, "What is the point?" She told him that she kept coming back to him, partly because speaking the thought out loud made it smaller, made it bearable, made it less like a stone on her chest and more like a word she could examine at arm's length and choose not to be crushed by. The wolf never moved, never reacted, never answered. But the wind always did something when she spoke, stilled or shifted, turned warm for a moment and then didn't, changed its direction the way a person changes the direction of their attention when something they hadn't noticed suddenly catches their eye. Alara noticed. She kept speaking, because silence felt heavier when she didn't. Oh, beneath the frost. What Alara did not know, could not have known, standing in the blue-dark clearing with her lantern and her words, was what her voice had been doing, year after year beneath the ice. The wolf had once been Kalor. This is worth saying carefully because the word wolf suggests something simpler than what he was. He had not been a beast wearing a crown. He had not been a powerful creature who ruled by virtue of force. He had been something rarer, a ruler who ruled because the land itself had recognized something in him, some quality of steadiness, of rootedness, of being so entirely and uncompromisingly himself that the ancient powers of the North had looked at him and thought, yes, this one. He had been the first alpha of the North, a title that carried weight beyond its syllables. Not merely the leader of a pack, the anchor of an entire ecological and spiritual system, the living fulcrum around which the balance of Everfrost turned. Winter obeyed him, not because he commanded it, but because he understood it, the way you understand a very old and very powerful friend, not by trying to control them, but by knowing them well enough to ask rather than demand. For 70 years, Kaelor had been that anchor. 70 years of quiet governance and careful balance, of standing at the border between the wild cold and the fragile warmth of human life, and holding that border steady with the patient, endless effort of someone who believes the work is worth doing even when no one sees you doing it. Then the Fire King came. He came from the south, moist from lands where summer was presumptuous and winter was an insult to be endured rather than respected. He came with armies and instruments of heat and the particular arrogance of a man who has never encountered a force he couldn't either conquer or melt. He came to Everfrost with the stated intention of bringing it into the modern age, by which he meant the age of his supremacy. He had underestimated the North. He had underestimated Kaelor, but Kaelor had also underestimated the cost of winning. The binding spell, the ritual by which Kaelor had called winter itself as an ally against the Fire King's forces, required sacrifice. Every working of true power requires something real in exchange. The universe is meticulous about balancing its ledgers. Kaelor had given it everything he had, his motion, his voice, his free existence, and his ability to feel the sun on his fur and the wind in his teeth and the ground beneath his paws. Winter answered. The Fire King's armies were turned back. The North was saved. And Kaelor stood in the center of the clearing and felt the ice close around him like a fist. And the last thing he was able to do before consciousness narrowed to a dim, distant point was look at the valley he had spent his life protecting and think it was worth it. He had expected oblivion. Instead, he got 300 years of waiting. So at first, there was nothing but the ice and the cold pressing in from all sides, and the slow, terrible knowledge that the binding had not ended him. It had merely stopped him. Like a clock someone had removed the hands from, still counting time internally, still aware of its own mechanism but unable to show it, unable to express it, unable to communicate to anyone that it was still running. Decades passed. He heard nothing but wind and the deep structural groaning of glaciers. He felt nothing but the pressure of centuries of ice. He began, in those long, blank years, to understand something about loneliness that he had never understood before, that the worst kind was not the absence of other people. It was the absence of being perceived. The feeling of existing in a space where no one's attention would ever find you, where you might as well not be there at all. He had nearly lost himself to it, to that gray dissolution of selfhood that happens when there is nothing and no one to reflect you back to yourself, when the voice came. Faint at first, like warmth through stone, a child's voice, trembling, grief raw. I was saying, "I think you're lonely too." It was the most precise thing anyone had ever said to him. He could not respond. He could not move or shift or change the expression on his ice-sealed face. But something deep in the frozen mechanism of his consciousness turned toward that voice the way a compass needle turns toward north, helplessly, completely, without any negotiation. Over the years, the voice grew, changed, deepened, came back night after night, season after season, faithful in a way that he had only ever seen in things that were made of something stronger than convenience or comfort. She came in storms. She came in the long dark of midwinter when surely no one would have blamed her for staying inside with her fire and her 4 memorized pages of a book. She came, and she spoke not with fear, not with worship, not with the strange performance people sometimes gave when they thought they were in the presence of the divine, that odd mixture of reverence and showmanship that was really more about the performer than whatever they were performing for. She spoke with honesty. She told him about her bad days and her small victories and the arithmetic of survival. She told him about loneliness with the matter-of-fact directness of someone who had lived with it long enough to stop being embarrassed by it. She told him the truth about what her life was like, which was the rarest possible gift, because most people, when speaking to something they believed could not respond, either stopped speaking very quickly or began performing. Alara simply talked, and with every year her words chipped away at something far deeper than ice. They reminded him what it meant to be alive. Not the grand version of life, the battles and the binding and the 3 centuries of frozen sacrifice, the small version, the version that was a person in a clearing at night with a lantern and something to say, and the stubborn, inexplicable decision to keep saying it. That version. That was what she was giving him back. The night the ice broke. It was the coldest night of the year. That sounds like a simple meteorological fact, but in Everfrost, the coldest night of the year was a thing with presence and intention. It was the night the valley held its breath. The night the temperature dropped below the point where even experienced northerners stopped arguing with the cold and simply surrendered to the protocol of survival. More wood, more wool. More walls between yourself and the patience of winter. No stars moved. The sky was so still it looked painted. In the village, fires burned behind shuttered windows. Children who had been sent to bed early lay awake listening to the deep structural silence of a world that had run out of ambient noise. Even the animals in their pens were quiet. Not the easy quiet of sleeping, but the alert quiet of creatures who sensed that something was about to shift. Alara walked through all of it with her lantern. The flame burned smaller than usual in the cold, pulling itself inward as if trying to conserve what it had. She walked the familiar path through the village, past the bakers, past the well, past the tree line. Her breath made small, determined clouds before her face. She almost hadn't come. She told him that when she reached the clearing. "I almost didn't come tonight," she said, her voice soft in the enormous quiet of the valley. "They said the storm tomorrow will bury the lower fields. There's so much to prepare. I'm behind on the Hendersons' order and the well rope frayed again, and I've been tired in a way I can't seem to sleep off." She placed her palm against his frozen paw. The ice was colder than usual. Cold the way deep space is cold. Not the absence of warmth, but the active presence of something that had never known warmth at all. "But I thought," she continued, "that if I didn't come, the night would be longer. That's the thing I've never really admitted out loud, I think. Coming here makes the night shorter somehow. Even though you don't, even though this is just me, talking to ice." Her fingers were trembling. Not with cold this time. I don't know why I keep talking to you," she whispered. The lantern flame shivered. "Maybe I just need to believe something is listening. Maybe I need to believe that if I say enough true things out loud, long enough, eventually something will—" She stopped. The clearing had gone very still, not the usual stillness of a cold night. Something different, something intentional, as if the valley itself was leaning in. "I'm so tired of being alone," she said. The smallest, most honest thing she had ever said in 20 years of small, honest things. The world held its breath. And then, a sound. It began in the ground, a low, tectonic shudder that Alara felt through the soles of her boots before she heard it with her ears. Then it rose, deep and ancient and resonant in the way that truly old things are resonant. Not because of their volume, but because of the sheer accumulated weight of what they carry. The ice beneath her hand split, not slowly, not gently, like lightning through glass, a single catastrophic fracture line that raced from the point of her palm outward, up the frozen paw, across the vast expanse of the frozen chest, branching and branching again in an instant web of cracks that caught the lantern light and shattered it into 1,000 cold sparks. Ilara stumbled back. The lantern flame guttered and went out. In the sudden dark, the fractures glowed, faintly, blue-white and pulsing, like veins of cold light running through what had been stone and was becoming something else. The air changed temperature. Not warmer, different, as if the cold itself was rearranging, making room. Then the ground moved. An exhale. The first breath in 300 years. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was the most ordinary thing in the world, a living creature drawing in air, and it was the most extraordinary thing Elara had ever witnessed, because she knew what she was hearing. She had heard it thousands of times in thousands of nights of sitting beside a sleeping friend, or a living fire, or a living world. Something was breathing. The ice fell away, not shattering but dissolving, massive chunks releasing their hold and collapsing into fine powder, into mist, into nothing. 3 centuries of frozen stillness coming undone in the span of a few extraordinary seconds. And then, the eyes. They opened. Not blue, not icy, not the pale, unseeing color of frozen things, molten silver. Alive and luminous and burning with 300 years of accumulated attention, all of it now focused with absolute precision on one person. On her. Elara could not move. Not from fear, or not only from fear. From the particular paralysis of someone whose nervous system has just encountered something it had no existing framework for. The impossible made real. The long imagined made actual. The silence finally broken. The first word. The ice did not shatter violently. That is the detail Elara would remember years later when she tried to describe what had happened in the clearing. She had expected violence, some great explosive release, the detonation of 3 centuries of compressed stillness. Instead, the ice fell away slowly, like skin being shed, like a thing that had been held too long finally being set down with care. Massive chunks dissolved at his paws, softening as they fell into something more like snow, more like mist, more like nothing. The frost that had coated every strand of his enormous body steamed gently as the living warmth beneath it, warmth that had survived 300 years of winter through sheer obstinacy, met the open air. He was enormous. This is difficult to convey without standing where Elara stood. The sheer enormity of a creature that had always been present as a monument and was now, suddenly, a living thing. His shoulder rose above the pines. His paw, when it lifted from the ice-cracked earth and set down again, made the ground shudder. His breath, when it came, moved the air the way a bellows moves the air in a smithy, purposeful, heated, alive. As he lowered his colossal head toward her. She did not run. Later, people would ask her why she didn't run, and she would struggle to explain it in terms that made any sense. The nearest she could get was, because the running moment had passed. Not because she was brave. She had been frightened, profoundly and completely, in the way that her body had simply listed all her vital functions as temporarily unavailable. But fear, she had discovered a long time ago, was not the thing that decided whether you stayed or went. Something else decided, something that lived deeper than fear. The wolf's voice was not sound. That was the first thing she understood, in the moment after the first word. It was resonance. It filled her bones the way a deep bell fills a room, not entering through the ears but through the structure of things. Through the joints and marrow and the cage of her ribs and the space behind her sternum where grief and wonder competed for the same real estate. 2 words. 2 words that reconfigured everything. You stayed. Her knees buckled. Not gracefully. She went down to the snow-covered ground the way things go down when the load they've been carrying is suddenly gone. Not with collapse, but with release. She was on her knees in the clearing and there were tears streaming down her face. And she didn't know when that had started and she didn't particularly care, because the tears were not from fear. They were from the relief that lives on the other side of a very, very long time of not being heard. You heard me? Her voice came out smaller than she intended. The resonance came back, every word, every night, as every true thing you said into the silence. I heard all of it. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. I thought I was foolish, she managed. A pause. Then, and she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe this moment, and she would always fail because no arrangement of words she ever found was adequate to the thing itself. You were brave. He stepped fully from his prison then. The earth trembled, not violently, not with the violence of something breaking, but with the seismic inevitability of something immense resuming its rightful relationship with the ground. His paws found the frozen earth, his full weight settled, and the valley, which had been holding itself in the peculiar, breath-held stillness of something about to change, exhaled. The wind returned, not cutting, not cruel. Not the judgmental howl that the villagers knew and kept their shutters closed against. Something different, something that felt, for the first time in 300 years, alive. Genuinely, recognizably alive, like a living thing drawing breath rather than a force exerting will. Kaelor looked down at her. She looked up at him, and between them, in the dark and cold of the valley's deepest night, something passed that neither of them had a word for yet. Awakening the Alpha, the valley did not wait for morning to react. The shift in balance, the release of 3 centuries of compressed power, was felt immediately and broadly. Snowstorms spiraled up from flat ground without any wind to cause them. Ice along rooftops cracked with sounds like gunshots in the quiet night, sending shards into the dark streets below. The temperature, already extreme, dropped another impossible degree and then swung back, fluctuating wildly as if whatever force had been maintaining the valley's careful equilibrium had suddenly lost its footing. The wolves felt it first. From distant mountains, ranges so far from the valley that no one in the village had ever visited them, came the sound of howling. Not one wolf, not a pack, something more coordinated than that. Something that sounded less like wolves communicating and more like wolves responding to a call they had been waiting 300 years to receive. The villagers woke in stages, first those whose sleep was lightest, who stumbled to frosted windows and saw the spiraling snow and the cracked ice and the sky that felt wrong in ways they couldn't immediately articulate. Then the others, east pulled awake by the sound of their neighbors' doors, by the communal alarm of a community that had survived many winters by learning quickly when something was not winter. "Ilara!" someone cried, when they found her cottage dark and empty. The fire banked, but the door unlatched. And the note of panic in that voice was interesting, in its way, because it was the first time most of them had called her name with any urgency, the first time her absence had registered as something requiring immediate attention. They gathered torches and lanterns and went, through the village, through the tree line, into the clearing, and stopped, fell silent, and then one by one fell to their knees, because the frozen wolf was gone, and in his place stood something that the human mind, encountering it without warning, struggled to process as real. He was alive in a way that made everything else in the clearing look slightly less alive by comparison. His silver fur moved with the wind rather than holding against it. His eyes swept the assembled villagers with a gaze that was not hostile, but was absolutely, comprehensively unimpressed. He stood with the particular stillness of something that had complete confidence in its own power and therefore had no need to perform it. And beside him, small by comparison, which was inevitable, stood Ilara, the girl they had ignored, the girl who mended their furs and hauled their water and chopped their wood and asked for just enough coin to survive and received slightly less. The girl who had spoken to what they called a statue for 8 years, and who was now standing next to a living legend with her lantern held loosely at her side and an expression on her face that was harder to read than anything they had expected. Not triumph, not vindication, not the "I told you so" that they perhaps deserved. Something quieter, something that looked, to those who knew how to look, very much like peace. The elder of the village was the first to find his voice. He had served for 40 years on the strength of his voice, a rich, commanding instrument that had shepherded his people through floods and famine and 3 failed harvests and the long political machinations of a trade route dispute with the valley to the east. His voice had always been adequate to whatever the moment required. Standing before Kaelor, It came out smaller than he intended. "What have you done?" he asked Alara. Because it was safer to ask Alara than to ask the thing that had replaced the statue. She opened her mouth. Kaelor stepped forward. The air changed. It did not change with violence. It changed with the precision of something that knows exactly how much force is required. The way the tide changes when the moon says so, not through effort, but through authority. The snow lifted from the ground in a slow spiral. The lanterns flickered and recovered. And the resonance, that bone-deep, marrow-filling resonance that was Kaelor's voice, filled the clearing. She freed me. The hunters dropped their weapons, not because they were afraid, though they were, but because holding weapons suddenly seemed to require a justification they no longer had. "Your fear has chained this valley for 3 centuries. You built your walls against me. What you taught your children to keep their eyes down and their fires small and their courage banked against anything larger than the next sunrise. You called it wisdom. It was only fear." The elder's face worked through several emotions in quick succession. "We were preserving the balance," he said. "We kept the curse contained." Kaelor's silver eyes moved to him. Slowly, with patience. "You kept your courage frozen." The silence that followed had a texture to it, the particular density of a truth that has landed in the right place at the right time and is in the process of becoming undeniable. Fear and fire. Fear, in a small community, operates like weather. It does not require a source to sustain itself. It requires only conditions, proximity, memory, the human talent for finding patterns in noise. But the villagers of Everfrost had lived beside the frozen wolf for so long that their fear of it had become structural, built into the architecture of how they understood their lives. They didn't think about it any more than they thought about the walls of their cottages. It was simply there, beneath everything, holding the shape of how they were. And now, overnight, the shape had changed. By dawn, the rumors had eaten through the village like frost through unsupported wood. "She woke a demon," said one voice. "She broke the seal," said another. "Didn't you feel it last night? That shift? Something old and wrong and loose." "She's cursed," said a third. "Always strange, always too quiet, always out there in the dark, speaking to things that should have stayed silent." Though it is worth noting that none of these voices had ever brought Alara a meal when her resources ran low. None had come to her mother's burial. None had given her 14 coins when she was owed 14, or thought to ask whether a girl alone in a cottage at the edge of the world was managing. But all of them now had opinions about what she had done. Kaelor spent the morning in the clearing, relearning his own body. 300 years of stillness leaves its marks. Not in atrophy, the binding had preserved him as efficiently as it had imprisoned him, but in a strangeness. The sensation of moving limbs that had not moved in centuries. The overwhelming specificity of physical sensation returning all at once. The texture of snow under his paws, the taste of cold air through his teeth. The particular weight of his own skull as he turned it to look at the sky. Alara sat with him. She had slept for a few hours, curled near the great warmth of his side, and woken to find that the clearing felt different in daylight. More real, perhaps, or differently real. She brought bread from her cottage and ate it there, watching him move through the clearing with the deliberate care of something relearning its own capabilities. They didn't speak much that morning. They didn't need to. What had been said in the dark was sufficient for the daylight. The village delegation arrived mid-morning, the elder flanked by hunters who were doing their best to look purposeful while holding their weapons at a careful, non-threatening angle. Several other prominent villagers followed at a distance that communicated both their desire to witness the confrontation and their disinclination to be near the front of it. The elder spoke first. Credit to him for that. "What you have done," he said, addressing Alara rather than Kaelor, which was a choice that Kaelor allowed for now, "affects all of us. You had no right." Ilara looked at him. She looked at him with those gray eyes that were the color of the valley sky before a storm, not threatening, but serious. And she said, quietly and without particular heat, "I had no right to speak, to come to the clearing that no one else wanted, to say true things to something that was listening?" The elder opened his mouth. Kaelor stepped forward. He did not step forward aggressively. You see, he did not lower his head or show his teeth or perform any of the threat displays that a lesser creature would have reached for. He simply changed his position, and in doing so, changed every calculation in the clearing. The air was thick with power that was not being used but was very clearly present. "She freed me," Kaelor said. The resonance of it moved through the assembled people like a slow tide. "You had 3 centuries to free me. 3 centuries to send one person with one honest word. You chose instead to build your walls higher and your courage smaller and call it survival. I do not blame you, but I will not thank you." The hunters had stopped trying to look purposeful. The weapons were down. Several people in the back of the group had quietly begun what they hoped looked like an unhurried departure. The elder, at his considerable credit, held his ground. "The seal was for a reason," he said, his voice steadier now than anyone had expected. "The ice held something back. Not just you, the thing that drove you to that binding, the threat that made it necessary." Kaelor was still for a moment. The elder was not wrong. "Yes," said Kaelor, "and now that thing knows I am free." The silence that followed was the kind that clarifies. It was not the end of the confrontation. It was the beginning of the real conversation. The greater threat Kaelor had not awakened alone. This is the thing about consequences. They are not self-contained. Every action ripples outward into a world that is paying attention even when the actors are not. The binding that had preserved Everfrost for 300 years had done more than freeze a wolf in a clearing. It had established a balance of power across the entire northern continent, a quiet equilibrium that every interested party had learned over time to read and navigate around. The Fire Descendants were not fools. They were the bloodline of the ancient king, attenuated by 3 centuries of intermarriage and accommodation and the slow, pragmatic compromises of political survival, but not eliminated. The gift for heat and flame had bred true, generation after generation, appearing in some descendants as a talent for smithing or glasswork, or the strange ability to stay comfortable in temperatures that drove others into their homes, appearing in others as something less domesticated. They had felt the shift the moment it happened, not with any dramatic vision or magical warning system, more simply than that. The way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm arrives, a shift in the quality of something you had grown so accustomed to that you'd stopped actively sensing it. The subtle, pervasive 300-year-old hum of the binding had simply stopped. In a hall far to the south, where fire burned in every hearth regardless of season, and the walls were hung with maps of territories that had once been northern and were someday intended to be again. A woman set down her cup and looked at the ceiling. Then she sent for her generals. Back in Everfrost, in the days that followed the awakening, Kaelor and Ilara spent their hours in something that resembled, structurally, a debriefing, though neither of them used that word. He told her about the binding, about the Fire King and the battle and the cost of winning it, about what he had understood in those first frozen centuries, about the nature of the power he had used, that it was not gone, that it was dormant, that everything he had drawn on to seal the North against fire was still there, still present, waiting for someone who knew how to speak to it, the way she had known how to speak to him. "Are you saying I have power?" she asked, on the 3rd night. They were in the clearing again. The village had given up trying to keep her home after the 1st night. The clearing felt like the right place for these conversations, neutral ground. Way if such a thing existed between a woman and a centuries-old alpha who had spent years listening to her voice through several feet of ice. Kaelor considered the question. I am saying that the power was always there. It chose to respond to you. Those are different things. She thought about that. Can power choose? Old power can, the kind that has been in a place long enough to have preferences. Winter chose to trust your voice because you never used it to manipulate. You never came to the clearing with an agenda. You came to speak honestly. And honesty is the oldest password there is. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands. To demonstrate that this was not merely philosophy, Kaylor did something then, a small thing, carefully calibrated. He breathed, and the frost in the clearing rearranged itself. Not dramatically, just differently, as if responding to a preference. Then he looked at her. Now you. She looked at him, then at the frost. Then she breathed, and the frost moved. Not perfectly, not with any precision, but it moved, a fine shimmer across the surface of the clearing, a slight rearrangement of ice crystals that hadn't been moved by wind or weight. It moved because she had asked. She looked at her hands again, then at him. That has never happened before. You have never been in the presence of something that could teach you what to ask for. They spent 3 more nights practicing. She was not a natural in the conventional sense. She did not produce spectacular effects or dramatic displays. What she had was something different, precision. When she asked the frost to move, it moved exactly where she intended. When she asked it to hold, it held. The power responded to her the way it had always responded to her voice. Honestly, completely, without the slippery margin for interpretation that made other forms of power so unreliable. On the 4th night, the sky to the south turned red. War comes again. The advance scouts arrived first. Not soldiers, not yet. The fire descendants were patient strategists, which was how they had survived 3 centuries of apparent defeat without abandoning their ultimate objective. They sent observers first, small groups of fire wielders moving through the foothills with the carefully unmartial posture of travelers who happened to carry unusual warmth wherever they went and left the grass slightly scorched where they walked. Kaylor tracked them from the ridge. Ilara tracked them with him. And learning to read the signs he read, the patterns in the wind, the behavior of wildlife moving away from heat sources, the strange orange tinge in the clouds over the southern passes that wasn't sunset. The village, when they understood what was coming, went through the predictable emotional stages quickly, fear first, then the particular kind of anger that lives on the far side of fear, then the complicated negotiation between self-preservation and something older and less comfortable, duty. The elder came to the clearing with a delegation, not to confront this time, but to listen. "We made the seal," he said. "Not just you, all of us. Every generation since the binding has maintained it. Whatever is coming because we lost it. So tell us, what do we do?" Kaylor looked at him. "You defend your valley," he said. As you always have. But now you are not defending it alone." The preparation took 2 days. It was not the romantic montage of preparation that stories sometimes offer. No epic arming sequences, no swelling orchestral momentum. It was practical and often tedious, and occasionally argued over loudly in the village square. Stores were moved to higher ground. Routes were established. Children were accounted for and given specific enforceable instructions. Ilara worked alongside the villagers for the first time in her adult life as a participant rather than a contractor. They asked her questions, not about power, about preparation. Practical questions, the kind that had always been her language. She answered them, and in doing so, I discovered something she had not expected, that the skills she had built from necessity, the resourcefulness of someone who had always had to manage with less than enough, were exactly the skills that the moment required. On the evening of the 2nd day, she found herself sitting on the well with Mira, the baker's daughter, who was perhaps 2 years younger than her and had spent most of those years ignoring her. "I'm sorry," Mira said, without preamble, "for all of it, for the not looking, for the 14 coins. Ilara looked at her, then said, "Honestly, thank you. I needed to hear that." Then she went back to work. Because there was work to do, the night the sky burned red, it was not like any fire the villagers had seen. It was precise fire, directed. It moved through the southern pass not as a wildfire moves, opportunistically, hungrily, without agenda, but as water moves through a channel, deliberately, following a predetermined path. They were not coming in an army. They were coming in a strike force, 6 fire wielders, each carrying enough heat in their bodies to melt a house to its foundations. Moving in formation, moving toward the clearing, toward Ilara. Because they understood, as their scouts had reported, that the binding had not broken spontaneously. It had been broken by a person, and a person who could break a 300-year binding by speaking honestly into the dark was not a person you left standing. Kaelor met them at the edge of the valley. The battle that followed was not long. It was not supposed to be long. A first strike is designed to be decisive, and the Fire Descendants had committed to decisiveness. The 6 moved in a coordinated pattern, drawing Kaelor's attention north while 2 broke east and west to flank, while a 7th that the scouts had not mentioned circled entirely and came from behind. Toward Ilara. The fire blade moved with the smooth efficiency of someone who has practiced this particular maneuver many times. The aim was not to kill, not immediately, to capture, to bring back the person who could speak to Winter and find out exactly how she did it. Ilara heard them before she saw them, felt the change in air temperature that preceded fire, a sudden uncomfortable warmth that her body, calibrated by 20 years of Everfrost, registered as wrong before her mind caught up with why. She turned, and the frost responded before she consciously asked it to. It came up from the ground like something that had been waiting for permission. Silver white and precise, spiraling up her hands the way water spirals, graceful, unhurried, inevitable. She had practiced this 3 nights. 3 nights was not a long time, but honesty, as it turned out, was not about practice. The ice surged from her palm. It encased the attacker mid-stride. Not violently, not with any anger or vengeance, simply, completely. A perfect prison of frozen intent, as clear and thorough as 3 centuries of ice around an alpha who deserved better. The fireblade was unhurt. They would remain unhurt until someone made a different decision. But they were very thoroughly stopped. Ilara's breath steadied. Her fear didn't disappear. She wasn't built for the theatrical fearlessness of stories, and she had no intention of pretending otherwise. But the fear rearranged itself around something more useful than paralysis. It became information. It became fuel. She turned back to the battle. She helped Kaelor drive the fire wielders back through the pass, not by matching fire with fire, which was not how winter worked, but by making the environment progressively inhospitable, dropping the temperature, thickening the snow, making each step south heavier than the last, until the strike force understood, with the clear-eyed logic of experienced soldiers who have encountered an objective that is no longer viable, that the mission parameters had changed. They retreated. They would report back, and the woman in the hall far to the south, when she received the report, would begin planning something larger. But that was for another night. Tonight, the valley stood. What she truly awakened. When the flames were extinguished and the fire wielders had retreated through the southern pass, when the valley's temperature stabilized and the unnatural orange had faded from the clouds, the silence that returned to Everfrost was different from the silence that had preceded the night's events. Not emptier, fuller. The villagers stood in the clearing for a long time after the battle, not with any particular purpose, not because there were decisions to be made or logistics to address. They stood the way people stand when something has shifted in their understanding of what is possible, and they need a moment in proximity to that shift before they can return to the ordinary world and explain it to themselves. The elder stood beside Alara. He was not a young man, and the night had been long, and the weight of recognizing how much he had gotten wrong over the course of a lifetime of careful, fearful governance sat visibly on him. He did not make speeches, he simply stood. After a while, he said, "I owe you more than 14 coins. Alara considered this. "Yes," she said, "you do." Then, "But that's a conversation for tomorrow. Tonight, everyone should sleep." Kaelor approached her as dawn broke. The light in Everfrost at dawn was singular, a pale, precise illumination that came in low and horizontal and made the frost on every surface glow with its own cold light. In that light, he was less enormous than he had seemed in the dark. Not smaller, exactly, but more present, more particular, more like an individual creature rather than a force. He stopped before her. His silver eyes were level with hers. An effect of him sitting back on his haunches, she understood, though the movement was so fluid and natural that it hadn't looked like a choice. "You are not my servant," he said, in that bone-resonant voice. "You are not my subject. You are not what woke me to command me, or to own my power, or to claim whatever benefit comes from being the one who stood in the right place at the right moment." He lowered himself further. That great, luminous body settling into the snow with a weight that was immense and deliberate and somehow gentle. "You are my equal." The bond between them pulsed. She felt it as she had felt it that first night, in her chest, in her palms, in the particular awareness that her nervous system had developed over 8 years of standing in the cold with her hand against ice and believing that something was listening. But deeper now. Established. Real in a way it hadn't quite been before. The way a friendship becomes real not at the moment of its beginning, but at the moment when it has survived something. Not ownership, not dominance, not magic imposed, magic chosen. "You don't belong trapped," she said quietly. A pause. The dawn light shifted. "Neither do you." She thought about that for a long moment. The villagers approached then, slowly, with the careful, respectful distance of people who were learning a new protocol and didn't want to get it wrong. The elder first, then Mira, then others one by until the clearing was full of the people who had spent years building their lives around the careful avoidance of this exact place. Now they were standing in it, looking at what lived here. The elder spoke for them, haltingly, honestly, with more of the quality she had always associated with the better kind of leadership, and less of the performance she had come to expect from him. "Stay," he said to Kaelor, and then, with an effort that was visible, "Both of you." Kaelor's silver gaze moved to Alara. She looked at the village, at the people who had ignored her and shorted her and not come to her mother's burial, and now stood in the clearing where she had spent 8 years talking to frozen ice, asking her to stay. She felt all of it, all of the complexity of it. And then she smiled, a small, genuine smile, the kind that doesn't require any backup from performance, and said, "We both will." A pause, but not as statues. The season that followed winter in Everfrost had always been something you survived. That was the entire grammar of it. Survive the cold, survive the dark, survive the weight of months without thaw. Survival was the verb around which every other sentence in the valley's life was structured. It was pragmatic and honestly honorable in its way. Survival is not nothing. Survival is the foundational accomplishment from which everything else becomes possible. But it was narrow. It was the whole of what the valley had, for 300 years, asked of itself. In the months after the awakening, the grammar began to change. It began small, as real changes always do, not in declarations or ceremonies, but in the daily calibrations of ordinary life. The first change was that people started going to the clearing again. Not furtively, as Alara had gone. Not with the hunched, apologetic posture of someone doing something they half believed they shouldn't. With intention, with purpose. Children came to play at the edge of it, where the frost was always particularly elaborate, crystal structures of unusual precision that the adults who studied them carefully concluded were neither purely natural nor entirely explainable. Kaelor allowed this. He was not, as it turned out, a terrifying presence, or not only a terrifying presence. He was also a curious one. He watched the children with an attention that was not predatory but something more like wonder. The intense, focused wonder of a creature who had spent 300 years without any stimulation and was now confronted with the inexhaustible novelty of a world that had changed substantially in his absence. He had questions. Many of them were addressed to Alara, who had become, by some unspoken collective decision, the primary conduit between the valley and the wolf. She answered what she could, admitted what she didn't know, asked the elder and the elder's records and the oldest of the old people in the village. And when the answer genuinely wasn't available, she said so, which Kaelor respected in a way he might not have respected confident fabrication. Honesty, again, still the oldest password. The practical changes were substantial. Kaelor's presence in the valley altered the weather in ways that the villagers were still mapping by the time spring arrived, or what passed for spring in Everfrost, which was less a season and more a slight relaxation of winter's more aggressive qualities. The storms were less arbitrary. The temperature, while still extreme, settled into patterns that were predictable enough for better planning. It was as if the valley, with its anchor restored, could organize itself. The wolves came from the distant mountains, not all at once, in small groups over weeks, following what Kaelor told Alara were threads of something he called the Old Call, the resonance that connected the first alpha to every pack that had ever acknowledged his line. They were smaller than him. They were not the mythological creatures that stories sometimes made of winter wolves. They were animals, mostly, with the particularities of animals, specific personalities, specific preferences, occasional inexplicable stubbornness. But they deferred to him with a naturalness that made the deference look less like hierarchy and more like recognition. They were more cautious with Alara. At first, she spent time in the clearing, as she always had, and eventually the wolves came to understand that her presence there was not conditional on Kaelor's, that she came whether he was there or not, that the clearing knew her, that the frost behaved differently when she asked it to. A young female with a torn ear, who the children named Sleet, and who Alara privately thought of as Trouble, began appearing at the edge of the clearing during Alara's evening visits. Sitting, watching, with the particular watchfulness of a creature making an assessment. One evening, about 2 months after the awakening, Trouble stood up, walked across the clearing, and laid down beside Alara. That was the beginning of the second pack, not Kaelor's, Alara's, or rather, the pack that formed around the space that Alara occupied, which was beginning to have qualities of its own. The thrilling dark. It was in the depth of the second winter that the truth the elder had spoken, the truth that Kaelor had confirmed with that single careful word, became undeniable. The fire had not died. It had grown. The woman in the hall far to the south, her name was Vey, and she had been waiting her entire adult life for exactly this opportunity, had spent the interval since her strike force's retreat doing what she was genuinely excellent at. She had been counting, measuring, drawing on 300 years of meticulous family records that documented every shift in the binding's character, every fluctuation in the power balance between fire and ice, every piece of intelligence about the valley and its inhabitant, and the slow, patient erosion of whatever had kept the seal intact. She had understood, from the moment her scouts reported back, what had happened. Not a magical accident, not a flaw in the binding. A person, a woman who spoke honestly into the dark for 8 years and was heard. Vey had read this report 3 times. Then she had done something that none of her generals had expected. She had laughed, not with scorn, with something more complex than scorn, the recognition of a peer, perhaps, or the acknowledgement of a method she had not herself considered. Then she had begun preparing. Not a strike force this time, an army. Kaelor felt them before they crossed the northern pass. He was in the clearing on the coldest night of the second winter when his head lifted, sharply, suddenly, with the abrupt focus of a creature that has sensed something at the edge of its range. And his silver eyes moved south and held there. Ilara, beside him, felt it too. The bond between them had deepened over the months into something she still didn't have adequate language for. Not telepathy, but nothing so clean or precise. More like shared vocabulary. The ability to understand what the other's attention meant, which direction it was pointing, what quality of focus it carried. She knew from the way he held himself that what he felt was large. "How many?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Many." She looked south. The sky was too dark to see anything, but she felt it anyway, not the way she felt the frost, which was immediate and responsive and local. Something larger, slower, like a tide change, distant still but certain. "They'll come back," she said. "Yes." "Bigger, yes. Not a strike force this time." "No." She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned toward the clearing, toward the frost that responded to her, toward the bond that pulsed between her and the alpha beside her. Toward the wolves sleeping at the tree line and the village beyond them and the valley that she had spent her whole life moving through as if she were its ghost. She was not a ghost. She was beginning to understand, something considerably more inconvenient to the plans of large and confident forces than a ghost. She was the person Winter trusted. "Then we won't just defend," she said. His silver eyes gleamed. Something in them that had not been there in the frozen centuries, something warm and certain and alive. "We will lead." She stepped closer to him. In the darkness beyond the valley, in the passes and the foothills and the long, cold road north, Vey's army was moving. Thousands of fire-wielders, coordinated and purposeful, and carrying with them the accumulated weight of 3 centuries of patient, generational ambition. They moved through the dark with the confidence of a force that has done its mathematics and is satisfied with the results. They had not done all of their mathematics. They had not accounted for the second winter's changes in Everfrost, the reinforced cold that had layered itself over the valley in the months since the awakening. The wolves from the distant mountains, 237 of them now, who had answered the call and who lay at the valley's edge in the particular stillness of things waiting to be asked to move. The frost in the passes, frost that Ilara had been walking through and speaking to, quietly, honestly, in the way she had been speaking to things for her entire life. Frost that had been listening. And in the village, the people who had spent 300 years building walls against everything they were afraid of had spent the last 2 seasons building something else instead. Walls against something they had chosen to protect. The difference in engineering was subtle but absolute. One kind of wall is built from the outside in. The other is built from the inside out. The elders' walls would hold. Across the distances of the north, other things were stirring. Not in response to the army, but in response to something older. The old call had been heard in ranges beyond even the mountains that the wolf packs had come from. Deep things, cold things, ancient as the glacier, patient as stone, and watching as the night sky, stirring for the first time in 300 years, because the first Alpha had sent his voice into the dark again, and the darkness had answered. Ilara felt none of this yet. She only felt what was directly in front of her. The cold and the bond and the vast silver presence of Kaelor beside her, and the particular quality of the night around them. Charged and certain, and about to become something that would be described in later years by people who weren't there, and therefore got some of the details wrong, as the winter wore. The The ones who were there called it something simpler. They called it the night the valleys stopped surviving and started deciding. Alara breathed. The frost breathed with her. In the distance, the army moved north. In the clearing, a woman who had spent 8 years talking to ice stood beside an ancient alpha and felt the cold coiling in her hands like something living. Something that had chosen her, that had been choosing her, night after night in the dark when no one was watching. Something was always watching. It had just been learning what it had. The wolves at the tree line lifted their heads. Trouble was on her feet, ears forward, amber eyes reflecting the frostlight. Kaelor stood. Alara stood. And across the mountains, kingdoms that had never considered Everfrost a threat, that had never considered the quiet, invisible, enduring things of the world a threat, would soon have cause to reconsider. Not with anger, not with vengeance, with the patient, precise, absolute authority of someone who had been listening for a very long time and had finally, at last, been answered. The night the world remembered its own cold. The first army unit crossed the northern pass at midnight. They crossed into silence. This was expected. The northern passes were always quiet at midnight. Ice absorbed sound. The wind at altitude moved too fast for lingering noise. The soldiers moved in careful, professional quiet of their own. No torches, guided by the fire they carried internally. The subtle warmth that their bloodline offered like a birthright that had survived 300 years of careful, not quite concealment. The cold, they noticed immediately, was different from what the scouts had described. Their scouts had been here 3 months ago. The cold then had been extreme but negotiable, the kind of cold that fire-born bodies could manage, that their internal heat could hold against, that they had trained for in the cold chambers of Vay's Hall. This cold was different. Not just deeper, though it was deeper. Intentional. The kind of cold that knows you are there. The vanguard commander stopped. Behind her, 2,000 soldiers stopped with her. Something was wrong with the pass. She had been in this profession long enough to know the difference between wrong as in we've made a tactical error and wrong as in the environment itself is hostile to us. This was the second kind. The frost on the pass walls was not the frost that frost was supposed to be. It was too deliberate, too even, as if someone had gone ahead of them and placed every crystal with intention, which of course was impossible. The ice moved. Not dramatically. Not as an avalanche or a wall collapse or any of the large, obvious threats that mountain fighting taught you to watch for. It moved the way attention moves. Not with any physical displacement you could point to, but with a sudden, complete, and undeniable change in the quality of the space around you. The frost was no longer passive. The vanguard commander was experienced enough to immediately order a retreat. She was not fast enough. What happened in the northern pass that night was documented later by the soldiers who returned and the historians who collected their accounts, and the documentation was thorough but persistently inadequate, because the events it described were of a kind that language, built as it is from the human experience of a world that operates predictably, struggles to convey. Winter moved. A knot as weather moves, not with the chaotic, impersonal energy of a storm system that is indifferent to everything in its path. As something purposeful moves, as 2,000 wolves moving in coordinated silence through the dark moves, as frost that has been spoken to honestly, that has been listened to, that has been given permission to be something more than climate, moves when the person who gave it permission asks. The army of fire met winter in the northern pass, and winter had been preparing for 300 years. Alara stood at the pass entrance. She had walked through the valley, through the tree line, up the ridge, and through the final scramble of the approach in the dark, with Kaelor beside her and trouble at her heel, and the bond between her and the frost humming in a way she was still learning to translate but was beginning, with practice, to understand. She could feel them below. The fire wielders, their warmth registering against her awareness like the glow of embers seen through closed eyelids. Many. Moving with the confidence of numbers, moving with the assurance of people who had spent generations preparing for exactly this. She breathed. The frost breathed with her. She did not issue orders. She did not wave her hands or speak words of power or perform any of the dramatic gestures that power is sometimes supposed to require. She simply asked, the way she had always asked, quietly and honestly, without agenda, whether Winter was willing. Winter was willing. What happened after that was not a battle, exactly. It was a reckoning. Not with casualties. Ilara had no interest in casualties. And Kaelor understood that the power he represented was most terrible, not in its violence, but in its precision. The fire wielders were not destroyed. They were simply made to understand, with absolute physical clarity, that the ground they stood on was not theirs, that the paths they moved through knew the difference between those who belonged and those who did not, and that the difference mattered. By dawn, the army had retreated south, not en route, in the deliberate, dignified manner of a force that has encountered a changed situation and is withdrawing to reassess. In her hall, Vey received the report. She was quiet for a long time. Then she did something unexpected. She asked for a messenger, not for a general, not for a tactician, a messenger, the kind trained for negotiation, for carrying words across enemy lines without provoking arrows. Whatever else Vey was, she was not someone who made the same mistake twice. She had underestimated what lived in the north. She would not underestimate it again. She would try, instead, to understand it. Whether she could be trusted, whether understanding was what she actually wanted, or whether it was simply the next approach, that was the question the following season would answer. But for now, in the blue dark clarity of a northern dawn, the valley of Everfrost was still. Not the stillness of absence, not the stillness of ice around a living thing that had been stopped, the stillness of a world that had made a decision and was resting in it. Ilara walked back through the pass at first light, with Frost still moving around her like something attentive, with trouble at her heel and Kaelor's enormous presence at her shoulder, with the long dark behind her and the valley opening ahead. She felt 8 years old and 20 years old and older than she had words for, all at once. She felt for the first time in her life entirely visible. Not to the village, though they would see her. Not to the history that would write her, though it would. To herself. The girl who had walked out in the dark and spoken to frozen things because silence was heavier when she didn't had become the woman who spoke to winter itself and was answered. The girl who had been overlooked had grown into someone the world could not afford to overlook. The girl whose hands had been calloused from hauling water and chopping wood had learned that the same hands could ask Frost to rise or hold or move or be still. None of this had required her to be extraordinary. It had only required her to be consistent, to come back, to speak honestly, to believe in the teeth of every reason not to believe that something was listening. She stood at the valley's entrance and looked back at the path she had come down. The frost of the pass glittered in the first light. Then she looked forward, toward the village, toward the clearing, toward the work that was waiting, the real work, the longer work, the work of a valley learning to be something other than afraid. Kaelor's voice came in that bone-deep resonance. "Are you ready?" She thought about it, about all of it. The years of hauling water, the coins that were never quite 14, the empty chairs at a burial in a storm, the nights in the clearing with the lantern and the hand against the ice, and the words that she spoke because silence was heavier when she didn't. The night the ice answered. She smiled. Small. Genuine. No backup from performance required. "I've been ready for a long time," she said. The frost moved, like something that had heard her, like something that had always been listening. She walked forward into the valley of Everfrost, and the world remembered it had its own cold, and the cold remembered it had its own voice, and the voice was hers.